Good evening, everyone. You can all hear me? Yeah? Cool. I'd like to welcome you all to MUHI's first public lecture event for Semester 2. This is the MUHI Non-Communicable Disease Panel, the interface of law and medicine. For those of you who don't know, MUHI is a student-run registered charity who are dedicated to elevating health standards by making a constructive difference to both local and international health issues. The public lecture program specifically aims to bridge and bring together the scientific and health communities, as well as the wider community. Tonight, I'll quickly go through the plan and structure for tonight's panel. So we'll start off with a 10-minute discussion about what NCDs are, which will be presented by Sandro. This will be followed by what we've achieved so far in tackling NCD, specifically with the tobacco and plain packaging policy, which will be presented by Jess. And then we'll open up to the floor for any questions for the remaining roughly half an hour. Now, before we begin, I'd like to quickly introduce our fantastic speakers we've got lined up for tonight. So, Dr. Sandro De Mayo is a qualified medical doctor. He's also the assistant professor at the Copenhagen School of Global Health, and is also a postdoctoral fellow in global health and NCDs at Harvard Medical School, and the co-founder of NCD3. Now, Jessica Casben is a qualified lawyer with 2 law degrees, I'm told. She's a research fellow at the Melbourne Law School and has previously worked as a senior lawyer in the Office of International Law of the Attorney General's Department, and also with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where she worked to defend Australia's tobacco plain packaging laws. Tonight we will have a Ask FM open for any questions you would like to ask throughout the evening. The URL is up here for you to see, so ask.fm/NCD panel. We are also taking gold coin donations, as we do for all of our public lectures, and we'll be taking those at the end of tonight's event. The donations will be directed towards one of our international programs, the Kenyan Village Medical Education Program. So, without any further delay, I would like to invite our first speaker tonight, Dr. Sandro De Mayo.
Give me 1 second while I plug in my technology, because I've just realised it's out of battery. I always love the introductions, and I love that you call me a qualified medical doctor. I'm not sure what an unqualified medical doctor is, and if I was, then Jess might have a new problem on her hands, but I was once a qualified medical doctor, it's true. Great. Okay, so thanks very much for coming along. It's great to see so many of you here on a Monday night. Is it Tuesday night? Monday night. I've lost track, sorry. And it's great to be here to speak to you guys as well. I work in NCDs. I've worked in NCDs for a number of years, and so it's great to see kind of growing interest and a growing concern from not just the medical community, but also from the law and public policy and the wider community. So what are NCDs, and why would I spend all my time talking and studying them? So NCDs basically are the leftover agenda of public health from the last century. So a terrible name, non-communicable diseases, starting its name with something that it's not is never a good beginning, and it's not very easy to sell or to remember. So just think of NCDs, but what you can remember is that NCDs 100 years ago were not the problem. So 100 years ago, the problems for public health, the problems for the healthcare system were infectious diseases, issues of water and sanitation, poor nutrition. And for some countries, for a few countries, that's still the case, but by far and away for most countries around the world, including the poorest low and middle income countries, NCDs are in fact now the leading cause of death. Why has that happened? A number of different things have occurred over the last 100 to 150 years. We've seen major gains in the nutritional value and food security. We've seen water and sanitation improve around the world, water security, and the improvement of of sanitation services and toilet access. And we've also seen a change in urban living, a rapid and massive process of global urbanisation. In addition, we've seen an ageing of the population as people don't die from diseases earlier in their lives. And so combined then with the commercialisation of our food system, with the insidious and very enormous forces of companies emerging over the last sort of 100 years in whether it's tobacco, food, beverage, and elsewhere, we've seen change in also our lifestyles and the way we live. And all of this has come to mean that now the single biggest threat to global health is a group of diseases that were not a problem at all 150 years ago. In fact, they were the leftover agenda. So when we talk about NCDs, NCDs are 4 main diseases. So WHO about 10 years ago started to realise that this was already the leading cause of death at that time, and they started to realise that maybe we should actually do something about NCDs. And so to try and limit the scope and make them a little bit more kind of tangible and something that politicians and the public could get their head around, they limited NCDs to 4 diseases. And so these 4 diseases were diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and respiratory diseases. Obviously, there are still diseases like mental illness and also trauma, road traffic accidents. There are a number of diseases that are non-communicable, you can't catch, but they're not included in the big 4 from the World Health Organization, only these 4 diseases. This is a 4x4 table that they developed, and what I would invite you to more focus on, though, is the vertical columns, because what's important to remember is that these 4 diseases are not just 4 abstract different diseases that we've tried to kind of somehow mash together to get more funding and to get more attention. Actually, these 4 diseases share the same causes and can be therefore solved in the same ways. So, as Jeff's been doing, addressing the structural, economic and social drivers of tobacco use and commercial drivers of tobacco use, unhealthy diet, coming back to the issues of commercialisation of our food supply, physical inactivity, the way that we've changed our lives through urbanisation and through industrialisation, and the harmful use of alcohol. When we talk about NCDs, I spend a lot of time talking about these diseases, and I usually talk about 7 classic myths that you need to kind of overcome before you can start to have a conversation about NCDs. Because when people think about diabetes, heart disease, cancers, lung diseases, they tend to think of fat, white, lazy American men. And in actual fact, the true face of the global epidemic of NCDs is likely to be female, she's likely to be living in Asia, and she's likely to be living in relative poverty. So the 7 classic myths that we talk about, first of all, that NCDs are a disease of tomorrow. In fact, this is not the case. In 2014, NCDs are already the leading cause of global death and disability and account for around 2/3 of global mortality. That NCDs are just diseases of the rich, that they're not a problem for low and middle income countries. This is also not true. We know about 85% of NCDs occur in the world's poorest populations, that NCDs cause poverty and poverty causes NCDs. But also it's important to remember it's not just globally that these diseases affect and perpetuate poverty, but also in Australia, the highest burdens of NCDs, the highest burdens of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, lung diseases and mental illness, along with all of those risk factors I mentioned before, are actually concentrated in the lowest socioeconomic groups. And in this sense, NCDs become an important and also concerning poverty cycle catalyst. Number 3 is that NCDs are diseases only of the aged. You hear this again and again, that you have to die of something, so why not die of a heart attack? Well, that's simply not true. We know that 50% of global deaths occur in people under 70, and I apologise for the medical students in the room. This might sound a little bit simple, but it's true that we no longer use adult onset diabetes as the term for type 2 diabetes, because in part we're seeing an explosion of this type of diabetes in children and adolescents. Myth number 4 is that NCDs just affect men, and it's important to remember that there's a two-pronged burden of NCDs on women. First of all, NCDs are the single biggest threat to female health and development worldwide, causing about 65% of global deaths. But importantly, females, whether they're here in Australia or in low and middle income settings around the world, continue to bear the brunt of the caregiving provision in families and in societies. And so if it's a disease that kills you very quickly, then the caregiving burden is relatively short or small. But when we're talking about diseases that can cause prolonged morbidity and a fairly painful sort of suffering mortality over, say, 20 years, we're now talking about a burden on the females very often in a family and taking them away from educational employment opportunities and undoing some of the major gains we've seen in economic and social development for women. And actually, interestingly, Helen Clark, the administrator of UNDP, talks a lot about NCDs for this reason. Number 5 is that NCDs are just a disease of laziness, and this is one that's incredibly apparent in Australian culture and the way we talk and think about particularly the obesity epidemic. I apologise for those who are at GHC on the weekend. You're going to hear the same talks, the same anecdotes for the 5th time. But when I first started lecturing, I was a little bit concerned that I would be not very good at teaching in a large lecture-style format. So I went to one of my older lecturers, one of my mentors, and I said to Professor over at Monash, I said, Robert, how am I going to know if I'm a bad lecturer? And he said, Sandro, if one person fails in your class, it's probably because they were looking out the window or spent too much time on Facebook. If 2/3 of your class fail, it's probably time to hang up the lecturing and go back to being a doctor. And yet in Australia we have a situation where 2/3 of Australians are either overweight or obese, but we continue to blame it on the individual. And this situation, you'll see probably me rant tonight about something, it makes me very angry because it's simply a ludicrous situation. It's a dangerous rhetoric that we entertain at the political level from our Prime Minister all the way down. But anyway, we'll get onto that later. And number 6 is that we can't do anything about them, and that's absolutely not true. Ban Ki-moon has said that NCDs are a political issue, not a technical one. We know what we need to do, it's now just a matter of doing it. The Foreign Minister of Norway said, we know what we need to do, we just don't know how to get elected after we've done it. We know how to prevent about 80% of diabetes and heart disease and 1/3 of cancers with the technology we have today, often very, very cheap and primary care based. And finally, there's some nebulous, jargonistic, sort of nerdy concept, and despite my demeanour and my glasses, I promise you they're not. So very, very quickly, that's an introduction to NCDs. Now I'm going to tell you 7 things you need to know that have happened in the space of NCDs over the last couple of years. So first of all, so when I started my PhD in Denmark in 2010, NCDs were a 3-letter acronym that confused pretty much everyone that I spoke to, including myself. This kind of started to change in 2011. 2011, we had the second only United Nations high-level meeting on a health topic. The first one was on HIV/AIDS in 2001 and led to the major developments, including UNAIDS and then PEPFAR over the following years. So that was sort of, they started to make it onto the global scene. In 2012, then, at the World Health Assembly, we started to set targets. This was a fairly abstract target, but it was a 25% reduction in relative mortality by 2025. And that was adopted, and everyone was like, that's a great idea, it's a great idea, we really support it. Nothing much more than 25% reduction. That's okay, because a year later, we came up with a global action plan. Global action plan included 9 voluntary targets, 2 of them were fairly general, and 7 of them more concrete. So we're looking at alcohol, we're looking at physical inactivity, we're looking at salt reduction, tobacco use, addressing blood pressure, diabetes. Then we're looking at drug therapy and counselling coverage, so the healthcare sort of structural sides, and NCD technologies, and then the 25% reduction at the top. I'll just flash through these. So we all got really excited in 2013. We thought, this is great. We've got these sort of voluntary targets. It's much better than this kind of nebulous 25% reduction. So then in 2014, we had a review a few months ago in New York, and we all sat down and we were and basically trying to start to translate what can national governments actually do to achieve the goals that we've set out. In addition over the last couple of years, if you're interested in reading more, there's a few fantastic sources of information. The PLOS series on big food came out. That really changed the landscape and started to talk about big food corporations in the same way we kind of think about big tobacco corporations. Fairly controversial, but becoming increasingly accepted. The Lancet have now had 4 series on NCDs, including a great article by your professor, Rob Moody, just in the last one, which I would encourage you. It's quite short, very interesting. I would encourage you to take a look. And finally, obviously, all of this is happening in the context of 2015, the Emerging Development Agenda, and with the 170-odd targets that they've now created, NCDs are going to be within those, certainly more so than with the Millennium Development Goals that they replace. But we can talk about that over the evening if you're interested. So that's all I have. Over to you.
Well, this will be a bit different. Are there any lawyers in the room at all? Other than Ali? So hopefully I pitched it at a level that will make sense. But I'm conscious that there is a lot to cover about the legal challenges of NCD risk factor regulation. And it's legal, I guess, is to be distinct or distinguished from other facets, like policy considerations, political will, or corporate power. So when I talk about legal, I'm speaking in a quite confined sense. I do want to start with some thank yous because you're all expecting Jonathan Lieberman to be here tonight, but he is sick and I am not Jonathan. But Jonathan and my supervisors at Melbourne University, Professors Andrew Mitchell and Tanya Voon, work on a project that's funded by what was formerly the Australian National Preventative Health Association and the Australian Research Council. So I would like to thank those bodies for the funding that allows our research, which is into the international investment and trade law implications for non-communicable disease risk factor regulation. So I expect that my talk will do little more than encourage more questions from you because it's going to be so high level in general. But I look forward to the question and answer where you will interrogate my gross generalisations and my lack of nuance. But I'm going to start with a quote, and bear with me, it is from a judgment, and it is dense and slightly melodramatic. After a great constitutional case, the tumult and the shouting dies. The captains and the kings depart, or at least the captains do. The Queen in Parliament remains forever. Solicitors General go, new Solicitors General come. The world is transitory, but some things never change. The flame of the Commonwealth's hatred for that beneficial constitutional guarantee, the protection of property, may flicker, but it will not die. That is why it is eternally important to ensure that the flame does not start a destructive blaze. It might seem a little odd to start with such a rousing statement in favour of protection of personal property in an NCDs discussion, but if I explain that that comes from the dissenting opinion from a Chief Justice or from a Justice of the High Court in the plain packaging dispute that was recently heard, it might start to make a little bit more sense. For me, the quote sums up a lot of what the legal challenges are in this space and really highlights the complexity of those legal issues for NCD risk factor regulation, which to my mind is the balancing of public and private interests, the balancing of corporate and individual interests, and increasingly the balancing of domestic and foreign interests. The issue with NCD risk factor regulation is largely unique in health policy in this space because it, more than anything else, is concerned with consumer behaviour modification. It's not about, it can be about treatment, but risk factor regulation is often about educating the consumer or encouraging the consumer to make different choices about how they use the products that Sandra identified: tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy diet, sedentary lifestyle, which in Australia we keep under the banner of obesity and overweight, which I acknowledge is a little bit misleading because one can be incredibly unhealthy and subject to NCD risk factor, but look quite slender and slim. So it shouldn't come as much surprise that if we're looking at consumer behaviour modification, the intended result of a successful regulation is a shift in consumption patterns, and that the result of a successful regulation is reduced demand for products, which in turn will reduce profits. So public health measures that impose age restrictions on consumption or sale or provide education to a population in the NCD risk factor regulation area will unlikely attract concerns about market access and competition, but evidence shows and past experience that those kind of regulations are not much good on their own, and they need to be part of or they're most effective as part of a comprehensive suite of complementary measures. So consumers have a range of pressure points, and this is what this complementary measures bundle is trying to get at, that we each make decisions based on different factors at different points, and we're trying to, in regulating for NCD risk factors, we're trying to adapt and challenge the consumer's decision making. So if you think about it in a nutrition example, nutrition labelling in and of itself is not going to have much utility in the absence of nutritional literacy, by which I mean an understanding of nutritional requirements and language. Equally, nutritional labelling and nutritional literacy is probably not going to be of as much utility or is going to have limited impact if the cost of relatively unhealthy foods is significantly lower than the cost of relatively healthy foods. And so hopefully we see that measures that involve taxation, packaging or labelling requirements, restrictions on advertising and marketing, requirements on product content, ingredients, become essential tools in developing a regulatory framework for combating NCDs. Equally, we see that all of a sudden, NCD risk factor regulation directly engages the interests of domestic and foreign industries, questions of corporate rights and responsibilities, and intersects with international trade and investment law obligations. So it's now not just about getting the health measures right for the health outcome, it's about getting health measures right for an economic outcome. So what exactly are these economic outcomes or these economic laws? And I'll use a tobacco control example because that is my area of expertise. For example, they can require protection of free speech and expression. In the United States, the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia upheld a lower court ruling that graphic health warnings violated free speech protections in the United States, extending the protection of free speech or the right to free speech to corporations. They also might engage acquisition issues. So under the Australian constitutional challenge of plain packaging, tobacco companies claimed that the government had acquired their intellectual property and their space on their tobacco packs, and that therefore they should pay compensation. It was an unsuccessful challenge, but that largely turned on a nuance of language and an exception, if you like, that isn't reflected across the world. So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. At the international economic law level, trade agreements are primarily concerned with disciplining discriminatory treatment and trade restrictiveness, and investment agreements are concerned with similar issues, but also with protecting foreign investors from government regulation and interference with their investments. It's important to note, though, that these agreements still provide for public health protections and actively note these, providing for either public health exceptions or for flexibility in the application in the interests of in the national interest. But the tobacco plain packaging measure is the subject of challenge under both these sets of rules. To give you a bit of a sense of what tobacco, I'm sure you've all seen tobacco plain packages, but for what their purpose was and why they look the way they do, it is better described as mandatory standardised packaging. And it was intended quite specifically to remove one of the last remaining forms of tobacco advertising in Australia and restrict tobacco industry logos, brand imagery, colours and promotional text. To achieve this, it prohibits the use of any promotional colours, graphics or logos, requires drab dark brown packaging, which has its own Pantone number and Pantone card if you'd like to wrap your iPad in it. It also specifies standardised placement, font, colour and size of brand names and generic and descriptor names. And the 75% coverage of graphic health warnings is an extra piece of legislation that works with it. The measure, however, applies to all tobacco products, regardless of type and regardless of origin. So it becomes a bit complicated to see how we're being challenged under measures that, or laws that are interested in protecting against discrimination when this is a non-discriminatory measure, or protecting against foreigners when this applies to everyone, and we have domestic manufacturing here. The detail of the claims isn't known, and it won't be until innumerable number of documents are released on the public record. But we can anticipate that a couple of the key issues that require consideration are the contribution plain packaging makes to its health objectives, the effect of plain packaging on imports, the existence of less trade restrictive alternatives. And whilst the majority of academics and commentators agree that the prospects of the claims succeeding are very slim, we are still seeing a challenge. And we're seeing it across forums by multiple countries and by multiple corporations, from countries that are signatories, if not ratified members of the FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which recommends plain packaging in its guidelines as a form of legitimate tobacco control. So for me, this clearly demonstrates one of the greatest threats facing NCD risk factor regulation: regulatory chill. Countries are constantly learning from each other in respect of successful NCD risk factor regulation. Canada was the first country, for example, to implement graphic health warnings, and it suffered through legal challenge after legal challenge on that front, and now we see graphic health warnings almost worldwide. Similarly, government media campaigns, age restrictions, point-of-sale bans are increasingly being used by developed and developing countries in their tobacco control raft. So whilst the prospect of the domino effect might buoy advocates, it similarly charges industry. Regulatory chill for them is an end in and of itself. It doesn't matter if their disputes are successful. They are interested in presenting a clear and present threat of long-running, resource-intensive legal disputes to stop the spread and progress of regulation. And we are seeing the impact of that in the plain packaging context. New Zealand, the UK, Scotland are all considering delaying, waiting to see what the outcomes of Australia's disputes are. And we can understand that. Investing in regulation is risky enough of itself. But if you're going to cost the taxpayer doubly, if not even more, in the defence of legal challenges, you are going to wait. This is obviously very dangerous, though, because the cost of a failure to tackle NCDs now is going to cost us much more than tobacco litigation in the future. And based on claims that we've seen levelled at the Australian government on plain packaging, in the context of it being a non-discriminatory measure, we can expect the same kind of claims to be levelled on any variety of NCD risk factor regulations that target alcohol and obesity as well. So for this reason, it's vital that public health regulators understand the domestic and international legal frameworks in which they operate, but it's also vital that their lawyers understand the complexities that NCDs pose and how frameworks need to be developed together. And even more so, it's really important that in NCD risk factor advocacy, we extend beyond our health connections and look inwardly, so that internationally we're engaging at a health level, and inwardly, domestically, we're engaging our health people with our trade officials, and there's a strong dialogue so that we can start to communicate and understand the challenges that each of us are facing, and maybe avoid some of the legal challenges that we're facing now. That's all.
Okay, thanks so much, Jess and Sandro, for those wonderful presentations. We're going to open the floor up now for any questions. And if you prefer to ask them anonymously, we also have our ask.fm/NCD panel. You can submit an anonymous question and we'll endeavour to have those answered as well. So did anyone have any questions at all? Yeah?
Just a really quick one. Thanks for that talk, guys. It was really interesting. I had one quick question. I mean, I know you mentioned at the end about some of the contributions to NCDs, and that a lot of those did come from the private sector in many ways. Did you think, have you guys come across any effective economic solutions, or at least economic incentives, to incentivise the private sector to care more about NCDs or be more proactive in that area that can potentially be used alongside legislation?
Sure. We had a similar question last week at GHC and Sydney Global Health Conference. I'll be provocative and then you can give the legal answer, the intelligent answer. I think we have to be very, very clear here to understand. One of the things that really angers me is that we continue to conflate the role of government with big business. And we confuse what the two are, and we accept that the two are frighteningly intertwined. Government, at the end of the day, is meant to be responsible to everyone, and big business is only responsible or mandated to its shareholders and to its financial bottom line. So whilst big business is literally only out to make profit, despite what they say, regardless of what they say, that's what they're mandated to do. And directors can get into trouble if they don't prioritise making profit for their shareholders. So big businesses are responsible to their shareholders, usually the super rich or the wealthier parts of society. And we have a situation where big business is now in a situation of increasingly controlling government. I think we have to be really, really careful not to continue to go down the path or get lost down the path of this corporate social responsibility and allowing them to self-regulate. I think that it's just, my feeling is that looking back over the last 10 years, we've wasted a lot of time waiting or trusting that this big business will self-regulate, that they have they will take this issue seriously enough. At the end of the day, I believe a company like Coca-Cola shouldn't exist. They probably think differently. And it's the role of the government to protect. They make a product that has absolutely no benefit to society, only causes disease, and yet we continue to pay for recycling of their cans and for all of the health costs that ensue from their product, and pay a ridiculous sum for basically sugar, water and petroleum, which all cost nothing. So, we need to my feeling is they shouldn't exist. They probably feel differently. I think that government's role is very clear. It's to regulate these industries and protect the public. The industry should not be involved in regulation, in setting regulation, but they should be involved in the implementation of regulation. They shouldn't be at the table in setting the public health or the political agenda, but they will inherently have to be part of carrying it out. I don't know.
No, I like the inflammatory. Yes, I'm probably more tempered. I think there are economic incentives. The problem is that, an obvious clear economic incentive might be subsidies. Subsidies for goods that meet certain healthy thresholds. Subsidies are equally disciplined and regulated at the international level, just as much as labelling requirements. The presence of multinationals makes life difficult because so long as you're regulating at a domestic level and you're regulating domestic companies, foreign companies might not like that. You might have one tobacco company that looks the same, but is constituted differently, separately and divisibly in each country. So you can have one company saying different things domestically than what it's saying internationally.
And that's the same with food companies as well. It's exactly the same.
Exactly the same. Food companies and exactly the same with alcohol companies. The number of beverages you think you're consuming probably all come out of one of two distribution warehouses and I don't know how many manufacturers. So because of that, I think it's dangerous to start incentivising. It is also, it raises a question for me about So are you incentivising change at the wholesale level, or are really all you incentivising a broadening or a widening of product lines? Because I'm still going to buy Coke. I don't like Coke, but someone is still going to buy Coke. And I am going to buy Phoenix Organic Black Cola. Because I love cola. I love the flavour of cola occasionally. So what you're encouraging from corporations is just to meet you at the table of language with the incentives, but still offer the baseline negative product and just create a new product that attracts the incentives and have it all. And they could set it up. It is so easy to set up a new company. So they could all set it up and it looks grand on paper. But it all comes back into the same coffers and doesn't actually promote change. That's why I think, I was going to say corny, but the consumer is your most certain and persuasive economic tool. A reduction in demand is a reduction in demand. An increase in demand for an alternative product, for whatever reason, because it's healthier, or because it tastes better, or because it's sustainably produced, is an increase in demand. And if you're profit-driven, you want to respond to the increase in demand.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Yeah?
I assume that intellectual property law is different between state to state. If a company decides to export a product to another state, what is their intellectual property law from the original state applicable, for example, to Australia?
So by states, we're talking international states. Yes, so intellectual property law is, yes, you are right, different from state to state. By the same token, there is an umbrella of intellectual property law and legal requirements at the World Trade Organisation level. So are you asking whether or not the implications of plain packaging going state to state, or the fact that you might still be able to use Philip Morris branding or Winfield branding in one country, but you can you then import that into Australia? The latter? Intellectual property protections are inherently domestic and tied to your domestic production. So if you've produced a product in America, you have to actually comply. As soon as you want to trade with another country, you have to comply with that other country's requirements, and product requirements include IP. So there are broader issues about registering and protecting your IP and actually using it. But as far as getting goods and IP in that sense, once you want to trade with someone, you have to follow their rules. And that's why those rules are at an international level.
Yeah, thanks.
Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Guys? Yeah. The next one's actually,
Yeah? I'll grab the mic.
So, obviously, infectious diseases in today's day and age receive a lot more attention than NCDs. How do you think we can convince the governments and public of the world that NCDs really deserve a lot more attention than infectious diseases?
I know, and I swear I didn't take you to ask that question. Great question. Mainly because Matt's and our team started an organisation a year ago called NCD Free, which is a social movement around trying to get more attention to these issues. So when we're not at universities giving talks or lecturing students or supervising students or writing papers, we fly around the world making short films and running boot camps, and there's one coming up next month in London.
In all that free time?
Yeah, in the free time. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we were talking about this the other day, actually. I was at the Victorian Department of Health, and we were talking about how we kind of get movement on these issues. I think that we have to actually get kind of pissed off by the situation that we're in and how broken our system is. We have a situation where children are, companies like Coca-Cola are allowed to continue in many countries advertise products that we know and they know cause disease to children in viewing times on television when we know and they know children are watching TV on their own, using tactics that have been proven through science, cartoons and all these sort of perverse, fairly disgusting tactics of trying to get kids at a very early age addicted to these products, which are getting more and more evidence that these products are also addictive. Caffeine, certainly, sugar as well. And I think that we have to start seeing these issues in a, formulating them in a kind of human rights-based context like we did HIV/AIDS. So the example you gave of, if you make a graph, and there's a beautiful graph from the group at IHME over in Washington, of how many people die versus how much funding the issue gets in global health. And of course, HIV/AIDS is like here. Relatively few people die for how much money we spend on HIV/AIDS. Now, I'm not saying we should spend less on HIV/AIDS, but it's totally disproportionate the amount of money we spend. Women's maternal child deaths are about the same number, but get a fraction of the funding, so they're like down here. And then NCDs are out here, right at the, almost no funding, even though they're largely preventable, easily preventable, and enormously more number of deaths. Why aren't we seeing the change? Well, it's more complex than a bug or a mosquito or an infection that you can go after. It's not something that we can just vaccinate against. So we don't have Bill Gates giving us $100 billion to come up with a vaccine against our food system or against McDonald's, unfortunately. And until very recently, people didn't see the links between development and the fact that NCDs threaten to undo a lot of the major gains we made in the Millennium Development Goal efforts over the last 15, 20 years. We have seen enormous improvements, and particularly around women's health, and we will see a lot of those erode as the burden of disease grows in low and middle income countries from NCDs. As governments and as intergovernmental agencies begin to understand this, we are seeing movement. But I would like to see, you're absolutely right, the consumer, empowering the consumer is going to be crucial to all of this. And creating a movement where people say, you know what, it's not fair to come into my home and to advertise products that we all know cause disease in times when I'm not with my kids, and then turn around and blame it on me when my kids become obese, and have a Prime Minister who does the same. The moment that we say we're not prepared to put up with that anymore, and then suddenly also, children are just the beginning of the conversation, because we'll all take to the streets and we'll say, kids deserve better, and then we'll be like, hang on a second, I also deserve better. And then the conversation will begin to change, as we saw it happen with HIV/AIDS and the huge global movement that was created through that. It's more complex, it's more insidious, it's more chronic. So it's a group of diseases, but we are working on it, and I'll come back now to NCD Free and check out our website and lend us your voice. We're launching a new campaign next month, and we'd love you to support us in that as well. It's only by, I think it's only by everything short of a revolution that we're going to kind of really see major changes. And the awesome work of lawyers like Jess who are, and you guys as well. I said to the group last week at GHC, get out of the clinic and get into politics. We need more doctors in politics. We need more lawyers in international trade law. And absolutely right, global health is not a medical profession. It's a profession that needs economists, that needs lawyers, that needs teachers, that needs communication specialists, the whole kit and caboodle. And that's also something that we're working on to try and move this issue forward.
I'd like to follow that up from a slightly different perspective, but echoing everything that Sandra says. But I think one of the other issues for us getting traction on this is actually ourselves, because regardless of the complexity of the issue and the insidiousness of it, and the fact that we all like a drink and maybe some crisps at some time, the nanny state argument is so pervasive and so strong.
They're going to take away my guns!
I constantly get, when I first explain to someone, and this includes highly educated political boffins that should understand the complexity of regulation. They do it every day. And I explain what I do, and I get
lost in the bottle shop. Oh my God, where's the pretty label? I don't know.
It's the French one.
Yeah.
That is what I do. But we automatically assume that what we've seen in the past in one NCD space will apply and be as successful in another NCD space. And that's not true. But it's easy, and it's really easy to fall into that because we talk about NCDs as a group. So we automatically talk about NCD risk factor regulation as a group. And some of the tools, the regulatory tools, are applicable across the board, particularly advertising and marketing restrictions. But there are others that, when you're talking about tobacco, it's a very unique product. And it's easier to get traction in tobacco because it is the only product that, when consumed as directed, as recommended by the manufacturer, will kill 1 in 2. Will kill 1 in 2. The same cannot be said for alcohol and unhealthy diet. But in allowing the language of NCD risk factor regulation to be undivided, we allow the nanny state argument's strength. And we don't question where we're getting that nanny state idea from. And if we look and we interrogate it enough, we see that most of the time it's actually coming from industry. And set up as industry associations that don't look like a fast food industry association. It just looks like a health food and
They're usually an alliance of some description. I love those.
And they're talking about nanny states, and they're talking about encroaching regulation, and they're talking about your freedom of choice. And we fall into that dialogue really quickly. So I think one of the things that we need to do is interrogate ourselves and interrogate our friends as to what nanny state actually means, and what regulation that encourages a different choice, but doesn't mandate a different choice or mandate a lack of choice.
Yeah.
It actually does to encroach on your freedom.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think that's a really important point. And this whole discussion of, I mean, I joked about they're taking away my guns, but that's literally the conversation that it came to when Michael Bloomberg tried to limit the size of soda servings in New York City. This fear that the government is like getting into your business. It's much better that the government gets into your business than big business. I mean, I would much prefer that the governments regulate, the way that my supermarket is set up, or how easy it is to get to work by bicycle or not, or what access I have to different foodstuffs, rather than industries who I know have an incentive to get me to consume more and usually poorer quality because it makes more profit. And I think also you need to think about, how many times do you go through your daily sort of routine and pass advertising for a company, whether it's like alcohol or, not tobacco anymore, but alcohol, food, big soda, one of those. I mean, what we're talking about of limiting advertising, no one is talking about saying you're not allowed to drink soft drink or that we're going to ban hamburgers. We're simply saying that hamburgers won't be so cheap, or that you'll get proper information that's not built to confuse you, but actually built in a way that you can and will understand it, giving you the power to understand what you're actually consuming in a serving size that's reasonable, not 4 times the size of 1950. And in an environment that actually encourages you to make an active choice to be unhealthy, not to make an active choice to be healthy. To me, that's not a nanny state situation. That's just kind of like the way the world should be. And then if you want to go and have a Big Mac, a large fries, and a bucket of soda, that's okay. You can do that. And you can live with the consequences. And we'll still all pick up the bill. But you shouldn't do that as the path of least resistance. And that's the situation we have today.
Okay, we might take one from the Ask FM page now. Following on, Jess, from what you're saying about translating regulatory measures from one NCD risk factor sort of sector to the other, we've got a question about plain packaging and junk food as such. It's been quite a big topic at the moment. What do you think the feasibility of it actually is in terms of a legal perspective? And then, Sandra, a social perspective? Is it something that could work or something that you don't think is feasible?
From a legal perspective, so this is going to sound like such a cop-out answer, but it really depends on what it would look like. Because if you're talking, like junk food in and of itself, you have to define that. What is junk food? Are we talking about CCs, or are we talking about all corn chips, including the biodynamic, organic, low-fat, baked, not fried corn chips? Like, what counts as junk food? What counts as unhealthy? And are you then, if you're going to draw really just finite lines around junk food, what are you leaving out unregulated and untouched? And it's really a question, that comparison of what are you regulating and what are you leaving out, that raises the most legal questions and issues, both domestically and internationally. Because if all of a sudden you can start to group all of the healthy ones, they're all they're all local, and so they're all manufactured domestically, and all of the unhealthy ones are foreign, and they're all manufactured internationally. Well, then you've got your typical discrimination argument. Are you actually encouraging consumers to eat less junk food, or are you encouraging them to eat the same amount of baked corn chips, which is still high in carbohydrate and salt? So where do you draw the line? So as an idea in of itself, I don't think you can just apply plain packaging to junk food. I also think it's really dangerous to start, particularly from an international perspective, but dangerous to start jumping 7 steps ahead. Like, tobacco control was progressive, it was incremental, and that some of its strength I guess, was fostered in that development. To go from no plain packaging and limited nutritional information and not a true choice to plain packaging, you haven't really addressed the underlying issue. I would not be suggesting that it's a natural next fit or an easy one to apply.
I agree as well, yeah. I mean, I agree and disagree, only because we're on a panel. We can't agree on everything.
Yep.
I think, absolutely, it's not the natural next step, and it's not going to be easy. But I think, for example, soft drinks, I would love to see a world sometime soon where Coke is in a horrible green packet. I revel at the idea, and gets me excited. I think for me, soft drink is an easy one. Maybe not for you, because I just go and talk about it and you actually have to make it happen. I think that soft drink is one, it's empty calories, we know it causes disease. These companies make enormous profits, and you have to remember that we bear the brunt. So there's a concept of negative externality. So when a company burns coal, makes electricity and sells it, they don't pay for the fact that in 30 years' time we're going to be up to our nipples in water. Okay, they don't pay for the ramifications of climate change. But it's the same actually with these unhealthy foods. So, as I said before, Coke gets sugar and water, actually high fructose corn syrup, subsidised product. The cost's basically nothing. The Japanese turn it into this delicious sugary syrup. They mix it with water, put in their secret ingredients, and then put it in a can. And we pay for all of everything that happens after we pay for everything after that as a society. And, that's a ridiculous concept. Why aren't they paying for if they want to sell the product, fine, but put the cost of healthcare and the cost of the disease that we know is caused by soft drinks into the $1.50 sale price of Coke. You buy a 12-pack of Coke in McDonald's, in America where I live, a 12-pack for $2.50. That's insane. It should be a lot more expensive. The true cost to society is a lot more expensive, just that we're all paying for it, and Coke doesn't ever see that price. I think that's where we could start the conversation on plain packaging, and maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but one day when everyone is disgusted by the idea of tobacco tobacco packet that has anything but olive green on it, just as we're disgusted by the idea of smoking on an aeroplane or lighting up a cigarette in this lecture theatre. When we totally accept that concept for tobacco, I think that it will be the next discussion to start of let's get Coke into olive green.
Can I just follow up on that? And
Bring it
because
back
we're on
to
the panel and
right.
there should be caps amongst fictions.
Totally.
But I think soft drink is a good example. But just to shine another, I guess, complicating light, and it comes back to talking about taking responsibility for ourselves and the need to change the drivers in the consumer more than the products. At least try and change the drivers in the consumer for a more sustainable outcome. Comes from the fact that I see a lot of people engaging with not so much the NCD, they don't see themselves as engaging with the NCD debate, but engaging with the diet debate for purposes of size and weight. And you see a shift from products that have high calorie intake or high calorie content to products that have low calorie content, but are pumped up with all sorts of artificial additives, to the point that you see people consume inorganic compounds with a zero caloric effect. That's got to be ridiculous. And if you're talking, again we come back to how you define things and how you label things and how you put buckets around things in regulation, if you start to target only high calorific soft drinks, are you encouraging a space, or are you going to unregulate a space where the calorie content is nil, but it's entirely artificial? And then see the consumer demand shift to something that gives them the same joyful satisfaction of the taste without the consequences, but possibly leading to consequences that we can't see yet because we don't know what's going to happen when people consume that much inorganic compound. So I think that's why you start with the consumer first, and there may be last resorts, and I think tobacco is a good example of reaching a last resort. But yeah, there are so many more complicated factors along the way that mean that we actually are the best tool if governments can encourage us to live the change. That will be much better in the long run.
Yeah, and the next step will be like tripling the price of, I mean the first step is like triple the price of Coca-Cola, limit the advertising, put an age limit on it, like limit the access of it, hide it so that when you walk into the supermarket it's not like Coke, 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 Coke. It's like hidden behind the thing, behind the counter with the tobacco. And then when you've done all of that, then we'll put it in olive green.
It's not olive green, it's now drugged up brown. No, I know, so it's the olive revolution. It was originally...
I'm sorry for olives, to be quite honest.
So yeah, it was originally
olives,
intended to be a dark olive green, and the Olive Growers Associations of Australia complained. They were devastated.
Fair enough, too.
And it's fair enough. So it is now drugged up brown.
I do want
And I feel like I need to say that because I feel for the olive growers.
I want to grab dark brown iPad cover.
Okay, great, guys. We're running quite short on time, so we might just take one more question from the floor if anyone has one. Yeah?
Thank you. My question is concerning the TPP. We know that currently we have the discussion going on regarding the TPP. I don't know, in case of public health expert and in view of the TPP, how do we view it, or how are we preparing? Should it be a success story on their part? Should it come to pass? What are we planning in terms of preventing non-communicable diseases in the presence of the TPP?
Okay, so yeah, it's a great question. And I do encourage you to Google after this session and you'll get a lot more information than I will give you now. But there's a lot being done in the context of negotiating the TPP in the health space and in particular in the tobacco space. What it looks like, we're not very sure. Obviously the TPP is a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which includes Australia and America, a number of South American countries, some huge groups number of drafts leaked, and a number of countries, including Malaysia, has spoken out quite openly about what they're seeking, and as has the US actually, about what they're seeking in the tobacco control space at least. So a lot of what we're seeing in response to plain packaging and increasingly stringent tobacco control laws in litigation is being, particularly the international level, is being reflected in the TPP negotiations. So countries are concerned to ensure that there is regulatory space carved out for public health measures. And the question at the moment, as I understand it, is between a number of different proposals, whether or not it will be a broad carve-out for public health, whether or not it will be a specific carve-out for tobacco, whether or not it will be an agreement-wide carve-out, or it will only apply in respect of investment provisions, which is a particular form of dispute settlement. All is up for debate. What we'll do after the fact will turn on what the document looks like, but Australia has made it very clear that at least to a certain extent it intends to be unhampered by the TPP, in that it is not considering supporting or being captured by investor-state dispute settlement procedures, which we understand are proposed and might apply to everyone else that's in the negotiating party, but Australia is, at least on last draft's look, is exempting itself from that. That's probably as much as you can do in the context of these kind of agreements, noting that the TPP captures a broader range of countries, but it doesn't necessarily, these agreements are generally built on templates, so a lot of the obligations we're seeing in the TPP will already have a number of other countries. And the way we're seeing multinationals structure themselves to avoid ISDS, investor-state disputes under one agreement, doesn't necessarily save you from an investor-state dispute period with that company if they decide to set themselves up in another country with which you have a relevant agreement and they can take advantage of it. So that's quite complicated. I'm sorry, it's a very it's an interesting and complex area, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But yeah, there are things being done. Whether or not we will prevail, we are yet to see. And there's certainly a lot being done by the NGO community in lobbying both in America and Australia, elsewhere, but very strongly in America and Australia, lobbying for these kind of public health protections. And it looks like they might be getting some traction.
On behalf of everyone here tonight, I'd like to thank our two speakers for taking out time in their obviously very busy schedule to be here with us. To be honest, we were actually a bit worried when we decided to have a doctor and a lawyer on the same panel that you wouldn't maybe get along, but I think we can all agree that it was a very, very entertaining discussion in this past hour. So if we could thank them both for coming. I'd just like to remind everyone once again before you leave, we'll be collecting the gold coin donations on your way out. Thank you very much.